thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers for having me. It's always a real privilege and pleasure to have the opportunity to come home and speak to and catch up with friends and colleagues from my long history here. When you present on day 2, you have two choices. You can completely ignore what happened yesterday, or you can get up very early and try to reconcile what you're about to say with what happened yesterday. And unfortunately for me, I chose the latter. So I've had an early morning trying to make sure that I'm comfortable that what I'm going to say to you is not inconsistent with what I heard yesterday. And I'm fairly certain that that is true. So let me start by giving you some old and some newer news and then reconciling that news with some of the stuff you heard yesterday. The first is, and I think we know this, have known this for a good long time, that more and more women are working. This is important. It has been consistent over the last several decades, although it's tailoring off. These data are not from Canada, but the data from Canada are very consistent with this. The less new news, but I think now more and more people are recognizing it, and here I want to reconcile with yesterday, is that fewer and fewer men are working. And the employment rate, that is people who are either working or even looking for work, right, has been dropping in a number of countries, and most pronounced, I think, in the United States, but has been dropping in a number of countries over the last few decades. So fewer and fewer men are working. Let me just point out what probably doesn't need to be said, but I'll make sure that it's clear that these are not, one is not causing the other. It is not that more women are working and therefore fewer men are working. Women are not taking men's jobs. As I get into this a little bit more, you'll see who's doing what a little bit and how that's absolutely not true. If you look at participation rates, and now this is not employment rate, these are just people who are participating in the labor force. It's by gender. You see that the Canadian story is not as pronounced. There's been a small decline in participation rates for men over time, not as pronounced as the one in the United States. This is data from the Bank of Canada. And for women, participation rates are growing and are staying, at this point, considerably higher than they are in the US. Okay. Why are fewer men working? Well, it's a complicated answer, but at least part of that, and some of this was touched on yesterday, was that we see an erosion in demand for low-skilled workers. And in part, this is because of things we could lump into categories called technological change or some forms of automation and globalization, where some jobs have left for other places. There's obviously other factors as well, but this is part of it. And if you look at the breakdown for men by education, you will see that the story is mostly a story of people with lower education levels who are working less. And David, I hope it's okay, now it's too late, but David showed us this slide yesterday, and you can see that comparing to the US data, this is the US and this is Canada, a similar, not quite as pronounced, but a similar pattern for low-educated men in Canada too, where the story is really focused on people with less education, and in fact, men with less education is the most pronounced. Okay. What do new jobs look like? And this is stuff from David Otter. He presented some of this at the American Economic Association earlier this year. And he classifies these new jobs into 3 categories, what he calls frontier jobs, wealth work, and last mile jobs. And in part, I'm going to show you this because some of the jobs are a little bit funny. In part, I want to point out some differences in who's getting these jobs compared to the average. So the frontier jobs are what we're supposed to think of as the new exciting jobs that new innovation brings us. And when you look at who's working in those frontier jobs, you see that fewer women are working there, that people are more educated, and they pay a little bit better than average. When you look at wealth work, and wealth work he categorizes as those jobs, in fact, it's probably helpful if I show you this, those jobs that are meant to support the people doing the frontier jobs. Let me just explain this, and then I'll go to that slide. And last mile jobs are jobs that technological advances require almost fully automated, but still require us to do a little bit at the end. So the frontier jobs are the new and exciting ones. The wealth work pay about average compared to all American jobs, but less than the frontier jobs. They are more likely to be women than men, and higher educated than average, but not as high educated as the frontier work. The last mile jobs, this is where you see more men than women, and you see lower educated rather than higher educated, and they pay worse. Okay, so what are these jobs? Well, the frontier jobs, the way he categorizes this is when they were added to the census as a category by decade. here. And so you can see some of these the frontier jobs are the cool new things that we think are happening these days. The wealth work my favorite there is the oyster preparer, where you have to have people who support these exciting new and high-paying folks. And then you have the last mile job, like the person who has to deliver the thing at the very end of the whole cycle, or check where the underground cable that's providing your internet is actually located. These things that are at the end and that may still require somebody later on, or may be pushed out. Okay. The last piece before I move on to the tax and transfer policies that I'm supposed to talk about, and I'll tell you why I'm setting it up this way, is we heard a bit yesterday and a lot over the last few years about automation, and you can pick any number of studies that talk about automation going forward, and the fear that in more developed economies there's a higher risk of automation. I'm going to join the chorus of people from yesterday that does not believe this is the front-burning issue, but just to mention it. Finally, just to turn to the other end, what's happening to within-country child poverty in rich countries. Here I have a few: Canada, France, my new home, and a few others. And you can see that over time, by this definition anyways, from the OECD, which is families living with income under half of the median, little progress. Hard to say this is huge progress on any front. It's been steady, but steady and stable, but not a lot of progress. Okay. With all that, what's the problem then? And then what's the solution? And what do we know about tax and transfer policies? So to my mind, the more immediate problem is that, not that we're all going to be automated, as I heard and others had mentioned yesterday. It's the roughly, I'd say, 10% of people that have given up looking for work, mainly lower educated people, and people who are still, even though we've been trying, living in and around the poverty line and not making a heck of a lot of progress. And the evidence I want to speak to is meant to speak to these policies. One can think about this in the context of a universal basic income if one wants. If one's going to do that, then I would say I'm going to focus on those versions of that are like a minimum guaranteed income or a negative income tax, in that they are targeted at those who need it more. Okay, so these programs are not that, but they are close to that. Okay. This is the landscape paper that I did with Hilary Hoynes in 2015. I'll update it at the end for Ontario of programs. I point this out for a couple of reasons. The first is so you get a sense of the generosity in total when you start to layer everything on top. And this is for a single adult, usually a single mother, living with 2 children in Ontario. And you can see how it starts to phase out over time. All right, some things actually phase in, but overall, things phase out. It's changed a little bit. This is what it looks like in the US. I'll leave that discussion to Robert. But some important differences: the absolute value is lower, obviously, and there's more of a phase in before the phase out. So ours is more front-loaded and phasing out. There's more of a phase in before the phase out, and it's in absolute numbers, it's lower. Okay. What do we know about these kinds of programs? And in particular, programs that are targeted at families, so either single mothers or single fathers or 2-parent families with children who are low income, but that's where most of the action is these days. It's for families. And what we know over the last few years, I've been doing a series of papers with Kevin Milligan at UBC, who probably all of you know, and we've learned a few things, I think, about how these programs do and don't work. The first is that when structured properly, they can have positive labor force effects. And this study showed that comparing those provinces, this is with the introduction, without giving too much background, the introduction of the National Child Benefit and related programs, and for those provinces that allowed the child benefits to replace, instead of basically crowd out or claw back, instead of clawing back from welfare programs, providing stronger work incentives for people to enter the labor market, we saw some positive effect on labor force participation, and we saw a pretty strong effect on earnings as a major source of income for single mothers. So that was one piece of news that we thought was good news. Some people might take issue with the way that we did it. The program, not the research, I hope. The second piece of news, I think that we've learned, and this is true in Canada, and I'll also show you data from the United States, is that these programs have had fairly positive effects on kids. Which, whether or not they're the primary justification, they're certainly put forward as one of the primary justifications. This is looking at mental health for children and also for mothers, because that's important both for kids and mothers as well. And we found with the increase in benefits, a pretty substantial increase in a variety of health outcomes, including a bunch of mental ones, which I'm showing here. These are all positive effects, so reduction in the severity of these kinds of problems. So positive effects on labor force, positive effects on child health. I'll show you these ones. We have data showing the effects on schooling as well, but let me just switch to somebody else's work just for variety and talk about work from the US, EITC, which has found also, and in fact the magnitudes of the effects are extremely similar to what we found in Canada, positive effects on education for kids from these programs as well. So combined math and reading scores, as well as separately, we see that there are positive effects as well on education. So for the list of programs that I will classify as cash being transferred from higher income families to lower income families, most of which does not require you to work, but some requires you to work, but does not penalize you when you work, we are seeing really positive effects. Okay, let me just do a little bit more digging that I've been working on recently, comparing Canada and US policy on poverty in particular. And here Hillary and I tried to do some work comparing absolute poverty, where we're looking at poverty, both actually market income poverty and poverty after tax and transfers, trying to do this in comparably measured ways across two countries. And the measure here, I told some of you it was 50%, but that was a mistake on my part. The threshold we use here is 60% of the median equivalized after-tax and transfer income in a base year, that's 1996 for this work, and then adjusting that threshold by the CPI over time. And so we are going to look at converted, pooled data from Canada and the US together to see how women with children have been doing in the two countries over time as these new benefit programs have been implemented and expanded. Okay, so for absolute poverty, what are we finding? So for both Canada and the US, we find that we've seen a pretty substantial decline in poverty for single mothers. Most of the decline in the US came earlier in the period, in the 90s. Canada also saw some decline in the 90s. It leveled off for the US after 2000, whereas Canada continued to see a decline in poverty for single mothers over the 2000s. So some good news for Canada there. We're not keeping score, but anyways, that's the... When you look at market income poverty compared to after-tax and transfer poverty, what we find is that, and here what you see is PI is market income. You can read these graphs, and then the dashed lines are after-tax and transfer policies, which are most of the policies I've been talking about. It's not quite so clear, I'll explain in a second. But so what we see in the US, actually in both countries, there has been a decline in market income poverty, but more of that decline, more of the overall decline in poverty is due to market income in the US, whereas more of the decline in poverty in Canada is due to the tax and transfer effects. Now, just to be clear, this is not to say that the tax and transfer policies are not having an effect on poverty in the US, because the way those programs work, and I assume that Robert will get into it a little bit more, is that they have work requirements built into it. And so in order to qualify for things like the earned income tax credit, you have to work. And so if that encourages work, it might be the program that assists in encouraging and promoting work, but it results in market income, which could lower poverty. So that's the difference I'm talking about here. I'm not saying it's all happening through the private sector in one country and all through the state in the other. I'm saying that the mechanisms are both state, but that the result comes more through market income in the US and more through the government transfers in Canada. The almost last thing I want to say about this work is that we then tried to account for the fact that, in fact, the countries have had quite different, as was pointed out again yesterday, different economic paths over the last few decades, both before, into the financial crisis and afterwards. And so we want to try and account for that. And so we have a regression framework that tries to actually separate out the net of other economic and labor market effects, poverty effects for single mothers. And here's what we find. We find there's a decline in both countries once we net this out, but again, that the gains have been slightly greater for Canada for poverty over this period. And I don't have a slide to show you this, but one of the areas where you pick that up to come back to where we started is in those people who are unable to find work because of the nature of the way our programs are functioning to support those who don't have work, as well as those who have limited work. Okay. There have been some evolutions since 2015. The data is not all there to evaluate them, and I'm just in the middle of trying to evaluate the effects of the new Canada Child Benefit. But let me just make sure that everybody's on the same page as to what's happened. I will call it the new Canada Child Benefit because I'm happy it's there, but it's not that new in the sense that it's not that different from what we had before. You can see here what the big changes were, and I think why not? I think they were positive changes in the sense that they did two main things. One, they took away the universal component. So the part at the bottom, the UCCB, which everybody got, everybody with kids got. It was taxable, but everybody got it. They took that away. And they pushed, you can think of this as pushing those resources into the bottom end to raise the level. And so in some sense, it's a targeting, a finer targeting towards need. They could have done other things, but those are the basic changes. And so I want to learn a little bit more, and the data are just starting to emerge for 2016, 17, 18. So maybe if I'm allowed to come back another year, I can talk about that. But so we're working on it now. But that's what happened. But you can see at least statutorily what is supposed to happen, which is that your income with child benefits should be pushed up so that more families are pushed over the poverty threshold. And so it will not be a surprise. Well, we know a little bit. We know that we saw a slight decline in poverty since the introduction, and that's not a surprise because statutorily that should happen because they pushed the threshold up to above the poverty threshold for some families. We'd like to know a little bit more of whether it had effects beyond that statutory boost in income, whether it promoted labor force participation, whether it helped kids even more, whether it helped other elements. So that's the stuff that we still need to learn. Okay, so let me sum up and say the following. We have seen, in terms of defining the problem, we've seen a decline in work for those with less education and for those in persistent poverty, which I showed you as a measure of child poverty. It's obviously not just the children that are in poverty. The recent efforts to reduce poverty show signs of working, and I would say that to my mind, income support programs have been particularly effective. I think that this speaks to where we might want to go in two ways. The first is the efficacy of targeting. As I said, it's my guess that the new child benefit, as it further targets, will have improved it even more. Also, speaking to the discussion around basic income more generally, which I know reports that have come out over time, and Hugh's report mentioned this quite clearly, right? The idea that we would want to approach this as a universal thing that doesn't phase out probably is not where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of helping those in need. Also, the actual cost is enormous when you think about a universal I mean, the math is easy. I can assign it to my 10-year-old son. Just take all the people in the country and multiply it by the amount you want to give them. That's for the U.S., that's $5 trillion. For Canada, it would be $500 billion. And then you look at the budgets of these countries, and you see that the Canadian federal budget is somewhere in the neighborhood of $350 billion, and the U.S. budget is somewhere, multiply that a few times up. But it falls, in every case, short of what we would need for a complete universal transfer, and so that would require an enormous amount of collection and redistribution that makes an untargeted program not that appealing, in my view. The other thing I think we're learning is that these program designs, even within the single category of cash transfers, actually can affect whether the market or the state is the main driver of support in the end, even though they're both state initiated. We see that the work benefits built into the U.S. system, it's our view that these have contributed to the fact that it is then market income that is driving the reduction in poverty there versus benefit income, after tax and transfer income, that's driving the reduction in poverty in Canada. So I think these programs are providing us with an excellent starting point. I would make one last point from where I started with the men not working, is that I didn't show you the graph of what programs looked like in Canada 20 years ago and the US, but there has been a real shift away from supporting low-educated men if they don't have kids. And so to the extent that this is a group that one sees could be in trouble, I would note that right now we don't have as robust a support system for that population as we have been developing and pushing for other groups in the population. And maybe I will stop there. Thank you.